it seems every week there's a few questions about vocals. How do you get harshness in vocals? How do you mix pop vocals? It was interesting yesterday listening to some of the super bright pop vocals of like some of the Julia Michaels stuff and some of these other things that are really intensely bright. That's a topic that you and I have covered a little bit. I think ideas about saturation, multiband compression. We did a whole hour on saturation, harmonic distortion. I'm also going to do a live with Matt Beckley, who's vocal produced a bunch of huge artists. We're going to do an hour just talking about recording vocals, vocal production. And we'll get into some mixing stuff too. But obviously, you and I talk about that. I don't know if you can. Is there any other thought you have relating that to vocals?
I can. I have a very specific thought that comes to mind. Okay, I don't think that things can be bright, right? Things can be bright. They can be deep. To me, it's the density and the lack of dynamics in the highs or the lows that make things sonically exhausting and samey, for lack of better words. It's just like there's no emotional shift from a verse to a chorus because the vocal top end is so dense and pressed up against the glass, versus a bright vocal that is dynamic and airy, like Mariah Carey, for example, or when I got to mix Ariana Grande back on her first album, I was trying to kind of mimic that Ariana thing. And it's very airy and very bright, very like 15, 16K, recorded really well. But it was dynamic, meaning there's like a push and pull to her phrasing. And it's not just held up here bright the whole time. It's so hard to listen to a whole pop album because of that high-end density. You can
almost
listen
like
to a
there's
single,
a buzz that goes the whole time or something.
And the whole album. I mean, on a single, maybe you can get away with it, but if we're talking about the longevity of an album you want to hear from start to finish, which is rare, but artists still want you to stream their whole album.
Well, their fans are going to listen to all. Yeah,
hopefully. That's arguable, but that's not
that's the idea anyway.
That's the idea, exactly. So I'm more concerned with high-end density and its lack of dynamics than the amount of high-end that you have in an EQ. So when I see, and this happens all the time, when you get a session in and every vocal, I think we talked about this probably a few weeks ago, it's like 51 vocals in the session, all the stacks, all the harmonies, it's all done on the same mic, same preamp, same converter, and there's an SSL channel EQ shelving 10K and up on every vocal. Yeah. No one talks about the additive nature of this. That's gotta go, right? There's no benefit of that. And that's poor monitoring, right? That's the problem with, you can't hear, so you think, it needs to be brighter, so let's shelf 10K.
Well, and also
not necessarily. Lazy engineering. Yeah, exactly. Like that's cool for
I've done it.
I've done it too. I'm on no higher ground here, but I did it knowing that I'm taking that off later to reassess in the mix process versus sending it to the mixer like, you do you, but the artist has already lived with that demo for how many months before it's getting mixed, and now it's a losing battle against the mix engineer because they're actually sorting out and placing the backgrounds below the lead, so the lead has the point of view, why aren't the backgrounds as bright as they were? Well, did they need to be that way? You're only caring about that. This is the demoitis conversation that I still haven't really worked out in my head. You like it that way because you live with it that way. If you lived with the background stacks darker than the lead to begin with, because the vocal producer / engineer delivered it to you like that, you'd probably also like it that way. It's the fact that you're not open to change, and it's not your fault, right? There's got to be a biological level here, this visceral reaction to change that we deem negative, right? Like, it's been this way. Why is it different now? Yeah. Versus some artists are great. Hey, I'm going to live with this over the day. It's different. I could hear why it's different. Let me understand the intention of why you made this different. Like, that's honestly, sadly, few and far between. It's mostly the other one. It's like, it's different, so it's not as good. Yeah. Versus, how is it going to translate to the world when it gets released, and then 10 years from now, right? Like, how is it going to hold up? Do you only want to make music for today? That's fine, but that needs to be understood as well. Everyone in the team should know that this is a timely record and not timeless. And there's so much to go down that path. But the high end thing really gets me because someone's like, that sounds dark. It's like, no, that's what it sounds like normally, right? It's like, it's darker than it was because that's just noise. Above 10K is noise most of the time.
Well, so let's hit it really quick to sort of recap it with vocals. Some of this applies to mix engineers. Almost all of it applies to sort of the producer, engineer, person who's capturing, recording, that sort of thing. That when you talk about density, if a whole lot of things are recorded the same way with the same EQ and you stack them up, let's say you have a certain EQ boost and you do it a whole bunch of times, that range is going to sound way overly harsh when everything else in the frequency range isn't happening. So things like treating your vocals differently, using some saturation, harmonic distortion to spread out and add more frequency range, treating background vocals differently, maybe even recording them differently than lead vocals. And then the other big thing, which you can't do as a mixer, and we'll get into this when I talk to Matt Beckley, is vocal performance is huge. That there's, when you listen to a song like, like
that's number one.
The ultimate modern pop to me is that I kind of grew up on was the Max Martin stuff. So you listen to a song like Teenage Dream, where it's very breathy, and then some sort of more chest voice comes in halfway through the verse, and then the pre is a little bit more, and then the vocal is actually in a very similar melodic range, but the song progresses beautifully with an emotional change and a timbre change in the voice, so that it actually sounds very dynamic, even though the whole song is just right in your face the whole time. So vocal performance helps a lot. There's all these different aspects to it that are all important.
So thinking about the same EQ, just to go a little bit further outside of vocal world, if you have that stacking that we explained occurring, and then you ask the mixer or the producer before it gets in the mix, hey, can we get more hi-hat? It's like, no, like you kind of can. No, so where now does the hi-hat exist in your mix? Does it exist lower? Is it a pitch down hi-hat? Or is it higher than the vocal? Well, if it's higher than the vocal, it's going to be inaudible, right? So we have to think, is your buzzy Juno synth that comes in the chorus audible because it doesn't have enough top end, or because the vocal has too much top end? Or let's not even say the vocal. Let's say the stacks, the background vocal production that you tirelessly did for a week, and you tried every harmony possible, and you worked so hard, and the lazy ass engineer was like, let's just put 10K on. Everyone likes bright shit. It's like, no, they don't. They want to hear that lead vocal. Yeah. It's just not. It's just too common for me to speak lightly on. It just happens all the time. And I want okay. Let's just say you're sitting behind you is a Juno 6 and you have a Prophet 6, right?
Yep.
Both of those vintage. Well, the one on the top is a emulator of a vintage piece of gear.
No,
the bottom one is vintage.
It's a Voyager.
No, the one on top. I mean, the Prophet 6. The Prophet 6 is a remake of the Prophet 5.
Yeah.
Both of those pieces of gear filter off at its highest point of 15K. That is as high as an analog filter on those two pieces of gear ever went. Right. So that ought to tell you that you need nothing above that to make that synth sound bright, because those synths are bright as fuck, but they're bright in they're oriented differently. They're oriented lower, right? We think we need all this high end when it only translates to noise. There's no music above 15K. There's air, and it should be used delicately and precisely on certain things.
If everything has air, then nothing
has air. So thinking about musicality in a vocal, well, it's in low mids, it's in the body of it. Maybe there's sibilance in 5 or 6K, 7K. We have to adjust, we have to reduce to keep it dynamic. Like, I can't hear above 10K. Nobody can. Or they don't know how to decipher the difference. I mean, most playback systems, like what I'm listening to now, you can't hear the difference between 10, 11, 12, 13. I can on my PMCs, which is why I spent however much I can decipher that to emotionally stack these things so you can feel something from it, right? Like, that's supposed to be our job. Anyway, that's all to say, be careful with your arrangement and your shelving. I'm going to challenge everybody here to not use a shelf for the next month. Don't use any shelf EQ, and be really precise with your bell and your cue. If you're engineers here or producer engineers, get rid of the shelf from the vocabulary. I have to say, honestly, I use a shelf 1 to 2% of the time for the last 5 years. I just don't shelf. So I would love to challenge everybody